Sometimes the most unlikely heroes emerge from the shadows when death comes knocking. In the dusty mountains of Afghanistan, while seasoned soldiers scrambled for cover and bullets whistled through the air, a quiet 19-year-old supply clerk named Sarah Martinez was about to prove that courage doesn't always wear combat boots. What happened next would challenge everything the military thought they knew about who fights and who survives. This is the story of how one desperate question shouted across a battlefield would reveal a hidden marksman whose steady hands and sharp eyes would mean the difference between life and death for an entire platoon. The morning started like any other supply run. Nobody expected it to end with a shy girl from Ohio holding a sniper rifle, making impossible shots while explosions shook the earth around her. But war has a way of stripping away everything except what really matters. And what mattered that day was simple. Someone had to take the shot, or everyone was going home in body bags. Sarah Martinez had always been invisible, and she liked it that way. At 19, with her dark hair pulled back in regulation style, and her uniform always perfectly pressed, she moved through forward operating base shank like a ghost. While other soldiers grabbed attention with loud jokes or war stories, Sarah quietly did her job in the supply depot, counting ammunition, organizing medical supplies, and making sure everyone had what they needed to stay alive another day. The base sat in the Logar province of Afghanistan, surrounded by rocky hills that seemed to watch everything with ancient, hostile eyes. Sarah had been there for 8 months, long enough to know the rhythm of the place. Morning supply runs, afternoon inventory, evening reports. She spoke when spoken to, followed orders without question, and kept her thoughts to herself. Most of the soldiers barely knew her name, but Sarah had a secret that would have surprised everyone who thought they knew her. Back home in Columbus, Ohio, she had grown up on her grandfather's farm, where Saturday mornings meant hunting trips in the woods behind their property. Her grandfather, Miguel Martinez, was a Vietnam veteran who had taught her to shoot when she was 12 years old. Not the spray-and-pray shooting that some people called hunting, but real marksmanship, the kind that required patience, control, and the ability to become perfectly still even when your heart was racing. Miguel had been a sniper in Vietnam, though he rarely talked about it. He preferred to let his teaching speak for itself. Sarah learned to read wind patterns by watching grass bend, to control her breathing until her pulse barely moved the crosshairs, and to squeeze the trigger with the same gentle pressure every single time. By the time she was 16, she could hit a target at 600 yards with iron sights and at 1,000 yards with a scope. Her grandfather never praised her directly, but she caught him smiling sometimes when her shots found their mark. When Sarah enlisted in the Army, she had planned to request infantry training. She wanted to be where the action was, to use the skills her grandfather had taught her. But the recruiter had other ideas. The Army needed supply specialists, he said. Someone with her attention to detail and quiet demeanor would be perfect for logistics. Sarah had agreed reluctantly, thinking she could always transfer later. But the Army had a way of keeping you where they put you, and supply depot duty was where Sarah found herself when her unit deployed to Afghanistan. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was surrounded by some of the best weapons in the world, handling sniper rifles and precision ammunition every day, but her job was to count them and store them, not use them. She had fired exactly 3 shots since arriving in Afghanistan, all during the mandatory monthly weapons qualification that every soldier had to complete regardless of their job. Her scores were always perfect, but nobody paid attention to supply clerks' shooting scores. On this particular morning, Sarah was preparing for what should have been a routine convoy to Observation Post Mustang, a small outpost about 20 miles from the main base. The outpost needed ammunition, medical supplies, and food. It was the kind of run she had done dozens of times before. Load the trucks, drive out with an escort, unload, and drive back. Simple and safe, or as safe as anything could be in Afghanistan. The convoy consisted of 3 vehicles, 2 armored Humvees for security, and 1 larger transport truck carrying the supplies. Sarah rode in the transport truck with Specialist Tommy Chun, who was driving, and Corporal Maria Santos, who served as the truck commander. The security escort included 6 soldiers in the Humvees, led by Staff Sergeant Mike Rodriguez, a veteran of 3 deployments who had a reputation for bringing everyone home safe. As they prepared to leave, Sarah double-checked the manifest for the 100th time. Ammunition for the outpost's weapons, medical supplies including blood-clotting agents, and morphine, and enough MREs to last 2 weeks. Everything was accounted for and properly secured. Sarah had learned early in her deployment that attention to detail could mean the difference between life and death. A missing radio battery or an incorrectly counted medical supply could leave soldiers vulnerable when they needed equipment most. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez gathered the convoy for the pre-mission brief. He was a stocky man from Texas with graying temples and eyes that seemed to see everything. Sarah had always respected him because he treated every soldier the same, whether they were infantry or supply. He never made her feel like her job was less important than anyone else's. The route to observation post-Mustang took them through relatively safe territory, or what passed for safe in Afghanistan. They would travel on Highway 1 for most of the journey, then turn off onto a smaller road for the final approach to the outpost. Intelligence reports showed no recent enemy activity in the area, and the route had been used successfully many times before. Sarah climbed into the passenger seat of the transport truck, her rifle secured in its rack beside her. It was a standard M4 carbine, the same weapon carried by most soldiers in the Army. She was proficient with it, but it wasn't the precision instrument she had trained with back home. Still, it was reliable and effective at the ranges most combat in Afghanistan took place. Tommy Chun started the engine and tested the radio. He was a cheerful soldier from California who always had a joke ready and never seemed to worry about anything. Sarah envied his easy confidence. Where she was quiet and observant, Tommy was loud and optimistic. Where she saw potential threats in every shadow, Tommy saw another adventure. Somehow, their different personalities worked well together, and they had developed an easy partnership during their months of convoy duty. Corporal Santos climbed into the truck commander's position, where she could maintain communication with the escort vehicles and watch for threats. Santos was a career soldier from Puerto Rico who had been in the Army for 12 years. She had a calm competence that Sarah admired, and she had taken Sarah under her wing when Sarah first arrived at the base. Santos understood that being one of the few women in the unit meant you had to work twice as hard to prove yourself, and she had helped Sarah navigate the challenges of military life. The convoy rolled out of the main gate just after sunrise, when the air was still cool and the light was soft and golden. Sarah always loved this time of day, before the heat became oppressive and the dust began to swirl. The landscape around them was beautiful in its harsh way, with rocky hills rising on both sides of the highway and distant mountains creating a dramatic backdrop. It was easy to forget, in moments like this, that they were in a war zone. They had been driving for about an hour when Santos received a radio call from the lead vehicle. There was a disabled truck on the highway ahead, blocking their lane. It looked like a breakdown, but protocol required them to treat any obstacle as a potential threat. Rodriguez ordered the convoy to stop while the security team investigated. Sarah watched through the truck's armored windows as soldiers from the escort vehicles spread out to secure the area around the disabled truck. Everything looked routine. The truck appeared to be a civilian vehicle that had simply broken down, and its driver was sitting in the shade nearby, looking frustrated but not threatening. Still, Sarah felt a familiar tension in her stomach. Her grandfather had taught her to trust her instincts, and something about the situation felt wrong. Tommy Chun turned off the engine and leaned back in his seat. "Looks like we're going to be here for a while," he said. "Want me to break out the car deck?" Sarah shook her head, still watching the soldiers moving around the disabled truck. "Something doesn't feel right," she said quietly. Santos looked at her sharply. Sarah wasn't the type to worry unnecessarily, and Santos had learned to pay attention when she expressed concern. "What are you seeing?" Santos asked. Sarah studied the scene more carefully. The disabled truck was positioned at exactly the right spot to force the convoy to stop, with rocky hills on both sides that would provide perfect cover for an ambush. The driver seemed too calm for someone whose truck had broken down in the middle of nowhere. And there were fresh tire tracks leading off the main road toward the hills, as if vehicles had recently moved into concealed positions. The truck's positioned too perfectly, Sarah said. And look at those tire tracks leading up into the rocks. Plus, the driver doesn't seem worried enough about being stranded out here. Santos keyed her radio. Rodriguez, this is Santos. My observer thinks this might be a setup. She's seeing signs that don't look right. Rodriguez's voice crackled back over the radio. Roger that. We're already treating it as a potential threat. Keep your eyes open and be ready to move if I give the word. Sarah continued scanning the hills around them, using skills her grandfather had taught her for hunting, but which translated perfectly to watching for human threats. She looked for anything that seemed out of place, unnatural shadows, movement that didn't match the wind patterns or reflections from metal or glass. Her patience and attention to detail, the same qualities that made her good at supply work, made her an excellent spotter. That's when she saw it. A brief flash of reflected sunlight from the rocks about 400 yards away on the hill overlooking their position. It was there for just a moment, but Sarah's trained eye caught it immediately. Someone was up there with optical equipment, probably binoculars or a rifle scope, watching the convoy. Contact, Sarah said urgently into her radio. I've got eyes on a probable spotter for 100 yards hill to our right, just below the ridgeline. Rodriguez's response was immediate. All stations, this is a trap. We're moving now. Tommy, get that truck started and be ready to back out of here fast. But it was too late. The hillsides erupted with the sound of automatic weapons fire, and Sarah watched in horror as bullets began striking all around their convoy. The ambush had been perfectly planned and executed. The disabled truck was bait, and the convoy had walked right into the trap. Tommy cranked the engine, but nothing happened. He tried again, and the engine turned over but wouldn't catch. Come on, he muttered, trying a third time. Finally, the diesel engine roared to life, but by then, the convoy was already under heavy fire from multiple directions. Sarah could hear Staff Sergeant Rodriguez shouting orders over the radio, trying to coordinate a response while his soldiers took cover behind their vehicles. The problem was that they were caught in the open in what military tacticians called a kill zone, with enemies firing down at them from elevated positions on both sides of the road. Through the truck's thick windows, Sarah watched soldiers running for cover, some already wounded and bleeding. The sound of incoming fire was terrifying, a constant crackling that mixed with the deeper booms of exploding grenades and the whine of ricochets off the armored vehicles. Santos was on the radio, calling for air support and requesting immediate evacuation for the wounded. But Sarah knew that help was at least 20 minutes away, and the way the ambush was developing, 20 minutes might as well be 20 hours. The enemy had chosen their position perfectly, with clear fields of fire and multiple escape routes. They could pin down the convoy indefinitely while inflicting casualties. Tommy was fighting with the truck's transmission, trying to get it into reverse so they could back away from the ambush. But the truck was heavy with supplies, and the transmission was old and temperamental. Every second they remained stationary was another second for the enemy to adjust their fire and find weak points in the convoy's armor. Sarah felt helpless, trapped in the passenger seat while soldiers she knew and respected were fighting for their lives outside. This wasn't what she had signed up for when she joined the army. She had wanted to be part of the fight, but now that the fight had found her, she was stuck in a support role, unable to contribute to the defense of her fellow soldiers. The intensity of the enemy fire was increasing, and Sarah could hear the distinct crack of sniper fire mixed in with the automatic weapons. Someone up in those hills had a precision rifle and was picking targets carefully. Through her window, she saw Sergeant First Class Johnson go down, clutching his shoulder. Then Private Williams stumbled and fell behind one of the Humvees, blood spreading across his leg. Rodriguez was still trying to organize a defense, but his soldiers were pinned down and taking casualties. They needed to suppress the enemy positions or break contact, but they couldn't do either while they were trapped in the kill zone. The situation was deteriorating rapidly, and Sarah realized that unless something changed dramatically, the convoy was going to be overrun. The next few minutes felt like hours to Sarah as the ambush intensified around them. Tommy had finally gotten the truck moving, but progress was slow as he tried to maneuver the heavy vehicle backward while staying low to avoid the increasingly accurate enemy fire. Through the radio chatter, Sarah could hear the desperate voices of soldiers calling for medical assistance, reporting casualties, and requesting permission to return fire. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez was doing everything right, but the tactical situation was nearly impossible. His soldiers were spread out among 3 vehicles in the middle of an open area, taking fire from elevated positions on both sides of the road. The enemy had clearly planned this ambush carefully, positioning themselves to create overlapping fields of fire that covered all possible escape routes. Every time one of Rodriguez's soldiers tried to move to a better position, they came under immediate fire from multiple directions. Sarah watched through her window as Corporal Jackson tried to reach a wounded soldier who had fallen in the open. Jackson made it about 10 feet before enemy fire forced him to dive behind a small boulder that provided minimal cover. The wounded soldier, Private Martinez, was calling for help, but anyone who tried to reach him would be exposed to direct fire from at least 3 enemy positions. The sound inside the truck was overwhelming. The diesel engine was roaring as Tommy tried to coax more speed from the heavy vehicle. The radio was crackling with urgent communications, and the constant impact of bullets on the truck's armor created a terrifying metallic drumming. Santos was on 2 radios simultaneously, coordinating with the convoy security team, while calling for air support and medical evacuation. Through all of this chaos, Sarah found herself falling back on the lessons her grandfather had taught her during those quiet mornings in the Ohio woods. Stay calm, he had always said. When everything around you is moving fast, you need to move slow and think clearly. Panic kills more hunters than any dangerous animal, and the same principle applied to combat. Sarah forced herself to breathe slowly and systematically scan the hillsides where the enemy fire was coming from. Her grandfather had taught her to read terrain like a book, to understand how elevation and cover would affect both the shooter and the target. She began to identify the enemy positions based on muzzle flashes and the direction of incoming fire. There were at least 8 enemy fighters, possibly more, spread across both hills in carefully chosen positions that provided good fields of fire while offering concealment and cover. The main threat seemed to be coming from 3 positions on the right-hand hill, where the enemy had positioned themselves behind large rocks that provided excellent protection while allowing them to fire down into the kill zone. But Sarah's trained, I caught something that the others might have missed. One of the enemy positions, the one that seemed to be directing the most accurate fire at the convoy, was exposed to return fire from a specific angle. If someone could get to the right position with a precision rifle, they could take out the enemy's most effective shooter and potentially break up the entire ambush. The problem was that none of the convoy soldiers were in a position to take that shot. They were all pinned down behind their vehicles, focused on immediate survival rather than offensive action. The weapons they carried, primarily M4 carbines and squad automatic weapons, were effective at close range, but not ideal for precision shooting at the distances involved in this engagement. Sarah knew there were precision rifles in the back of her truck. Part of her supply mission included delivering 2 M24 sniper weapon systems to Observation Post Mustang, along with specialized ammunition and optical equipment. The rifles were unloaded and secured in hard cases, but Sarah knew exactly where they were and how to access them quickly. An idea began to form in Sarah's mind, an idea so audacious that she almost dismissed it immediately. But as she watched more of her fellow soldiers get wounded, as she listened to the growing desperation in Rodriguez's voice over the radio, she realized that someone needed to do something dramatic to change the tactical situation. Tommy managed to get the truck into a slightly better position, using a small rise in the road to provide some protection from the enemy fire. But they were still trapped in the kill zone, and the enemy seemed to have unlimited ammunition and perfect positions. Through her window, Sarah could see that Private Martinez was no longer moving, and Corporal Jackson was pinned behind his inadequate cover, unable to help or retreat. Santos received word over the radio that air support was still 15 minutes away and medical evacuation would take even longer. 15 minutes might as well be 15 hours given the intensity of the enemy fire and the number of casualties the convoy was already taking. They needed a solution now, not in 15 minutes. Sarah made a decision that would have terrified her if she had stopped to think about it rationally. She unbuckled her seatbelt and started moving toward the back of the truck where the weapons crates were secured. "Where are you going?" Santos demanded, noticing Sarah's movement. "I need to get to the sniper rifles in the back," Sarah replied, trying to keep her voice steady. Santos looked at her as if she had lost her mind. "Are you crazy? We're taking fire from multiple positions. You can't expose yourself back there. Someone needs to take out that main shooter on the right hill," Sarah explained quickly. "He's the one directing their fire and causing most of our casualties. I can make that shot, but I need one of the precision rifles from our cargo." Tommy glanced back at her while fighting to keep the truck moving. "Sarah, you're a supply clerk. This isn't your job." Sarah felt a flash of anger that surprised her with its intensity. "Right now, staying alive is everyone's job," she replied. "And I'm the only one in this convoy who has the training and position to take that shot." Santos studied Sarah's face for a long moment. They had worked together for months, and Santos had learned to recognize when Sarah was completely serious about something. There was no bravado in Sarah's expression, no false confidence. Just a calm determination that Santos had seen before when Sarah was focused on solving a difficult problem. The radio crackled with Rodriguez's voice, more strained than before. "We've got 2 soldiers down and need immediate medical attention. The enemy is maneuvering to flank our position. If we don't get some kind of supporting fire soon, we're going to be overrun." Santos made a command decision. "Tommy, get us positioned so Sarah can access the cargo area, but still have some protection from the driver's side of the truck." Tommy nodded grimly and maneuvered the truck so that its bulk would provide some cover from the main enemy positions. It wasn't perfect protection, but it was better than being completely exposed. Sarah moved carefully to the back of the truck, staying low to avoid presenting a target through the windows. The weapon cases were secured with standard military locks, but Sarah had the keys as part of her supply responsibilities. Her hands were steady as she unlocked the first case, revealing a pristine M24 sniper weapon system with its powerful telescopic sight. The rifle was a thing of beauty, a precision instrument designed for exactly the kind of long-range engagement they were facing. Sarah had handled these weapons many times during her supply duties, but always as cargo to be transported and accounted for. Now she was preparing to use one in actual combat, something she had trained for with her grandfather but had never done with a military weapon against human targets. Sarah quickly loaded the rifle with the specialized ammunition that was packed with it. The bullets were match-grade, designed for maximum accuracy at long range. She adjusted the telescopic sight based on her estimate of the range to the enemy position, taking into account the elevation difference and the light wind she could see moving the grass on the hillside. Through the truck's rear window, Sarah could see the enemy position that was causing the most problems for the convoy. The shooter was positioned behind a large rock formation about 500 yards away at an elevation that gave him a perfect view of the entire kill zone. He was firing in controlled bursts, clearly an experienced fighter who understood how to maximize the effectiveness of his position. Sarah knew that taking this shot would expose her position to return fire from other enemy fighters. Once she fired, they would know exactly where she was, and the truck would become a priority target. But she also knew that if she could eliminate the enemy's most effective shooter, it might give Rodriguez's soldiers the opportunity they needed to break contact or at least reach better defensive positions. Santos crawled back to where Sarah was preparing the rifle. "Are you sure about this?" she asked quietly. Sarah looked up from the weapon she was checking. "My grandfather taught me to shoot when I was 12. I've been hunting since I was old enough to hold a rifle steady. I can make this shot." "Hunting deer is different from shooting at people," Santos pointed out. Sarah nodded slowly. "I know, but those people are trying to kill my friends. That makes it different." Santos studied Sarah's face again, and saw the same calm determination she had noticed before. There was no doubt, no hesitation, just a quiet confidence that came from years of training and natural ability. Santos made another command decision. "Rodriguez, this is Santos," she called into the radio. "I've got a precision shooter who thinks she can take out the main enemy position on the right hill. She needs about 30 seconds to line up the shot." Rodriguez's voice came back immediately, strained but interested. "Roger that. We'll provide covering fire to keep the other positions busy. Tell your shooter to make it count." Sarah positioned herself at the truck's rear window, using the window frame to provide a stable shooting position. Through the telescopic sight, the enemy position looked much closer than 500 yards. She could see the muzzle flash from the enemy's rifle, could even make out part of his body behind the rock formation where he had taken cover. Sarah controlled her breathing the way her grandfather had taught her, letting half the air out of her lungs and then holding steady. She could feel her heartbeat, but it was calm and regular, not the racing pulse she might have expected in her first combat situation. Her grandfather's training had prepared her better than she had realized. The crosshairs settled on the target, and Sarah began the slow, steady trigger squeeze that would send the bullet on its way. Around her, she could hear the intensified fire from Rodriguez's soldiers as they provided the covering fire she had requested. But all of that faded into the background as she focused completely on the shot she was about to take. The rifle fired with a sharp crack that was distinct from the other weapons being used in the engagement. Through the telescopic sight, Sarah saw the bullet impact exactly where she had aimed. The enemy fighter who had been causing so much trouble for the convoy was no longer a threat. Almost immediately, the character of the enemy fire changed. Without their most effective shooter providing direction and accurate fire, the other enemy positions became less coordinated. They were still dangerous, but they no longer had the overwhelming tactical advantage they had enjoyed at the beginning of the ambush. Rodriguez's voice came over the radio, excited but still professional. "Outstanding shot. That's broken up their main fire team. All stations prepare to bound by teams to better positions." But Sarah's problems were just beginning. As she had expected, the other enemy fighters had spotted the muzzle flash from her rifle and were now directing fire at the truck. Bullets began hitting the vehicle's armor with renewed intensity, and Sarah realized that she had made herself and her teammates into priority targets. Santos was already moving, preparing to relocate within the truck to avoid the concentrated enemy fire. "Sarah, you need to get down and stay down. They know where you are now." But Sarah was still looking through the rifle scope, studying the remaining enemy positions. She had identified at least 2 more fighters who were in positions where they could be engaged effectively. The question was whether she would have the opportunity to take more shots before the enemy fire forced her to take cover. Tommy was fighting to keep the truck moving, but the concentrated enemy fire was making it difficult to maneuver. Several bullets had struck the engine compartment, and Sarah could hear changes in the engine sound that suggested mechanical damage. They might not have much more time before the truck became completely disabled. Sarah made a quick decision. If she was going to help her fellow soldiers escape from this ambush, she needed to take down as many enemy fighters as possible while she still had the chance. The longer the engagement continued, the more casualties the convoy would take, and the greater the risk that they would all be overrun. She acquired her second target, another enemy fighter who was positioned to fire down into the area where several wounded soldiers were trapped. This shot was more difficult at a slightly longer range and with the target partially concealed behind cover. But Sarah's grandfather had taught her to make shots like this, and she had the training and equipment to do it successfully. The second shot was as accurate as the first, and Sarah watched another enemy fighter disappear from the engagement. The tactical situation was beginning to shift in favor of the convoy, but there were still multiple enemy positions that needed to be dealt with before Rodriguez's soldiers could safely break contact. After Sarah's second successful shot, the dynamic of the entire engagement shifted dramatically. The enemy fighters, who had begun the ambush with overwhelming tactical advantage, suddenly found themselves under pressure from an unexpected direction. Their carefully planned attack was falling apart as their most effective shooters were eliminated one by a precision rifle they hadn't known existed in the convoy. Rodriguez seized the opportunity immediately. His experience from 3 previous deployments had taught him to recognize when the tide of battle was turning, and he wasn't about to let this chance slip away. His voice crackled over the radio with new confidence as he began coordinating a more aggressive response to the ambush. All stations, the sniper fire has broken up their coordination. Team Alpha, bound forward to that rock outcrop at 2 o'clock. Team Bravo, provide covering fire and prepare to move on my command. Let's take the fight to them while they're disorganized. Sarah watched through her rifle scope as Rodriguez's soldiers began moving with the kind of tactical precision that had kept them alive through multiple deployments. They moved in pairs, one soldier providing covering fire while another advanced to better position, then reversing roles as they systematically closed the distance to the enemy positions. But Sarah's immediate problem was that her success had made her the primary target for every remaining enemy fighter. Bullets were striking the truck's armor with increasing frequency, and she could hear the distinctive whine of rounds passing close overhead. The enemy had figured out where the devastating sniper fire was coming from, and they were doing everything possible to eliminate the threat. Tommy was struggling to keep the truck operational as enemy fire concentrated on their position. Several bullets had penetrated the engine compartment, and smoke was beginning to rise from under the hood. The truck's diesel engine was tough and reliable, but it wasn't designed to operate while taking direct fire from military-grade weapons. "Sarah, we need to move," Santos called out urgently. "They're going to disable this truck completely if we stay here much longer." Sarah knew Santos was right, but she also knew that Rodriguez's soldiers were still in a dangerous situation. Even with 2 enemy fighters eliminated, there were still at least 6 more in positions that could inflict heavy casualties on the advancing soldiers. If she abandoned her position now, the convoy might still lose more people than they could afford. Through her scope, Sarah identified another high-priority target, an enemy fighter with what appeared to be a rocket-propelled grenade launcher. If that weapon was used against one of the convoy's vehicles, it could kill or wound multiple soldiers instantly. The fighter was positioned behind good cover, but Sarah could see enough of him to attempt a shot. The range was longer than her previous shots, probably close to 600 yards, and the target was partially obscured by rocks and vegetation. It would be one of the most difficult shots she had ever attempted, even more challenging than the long-range targets her grandfather had set up for her back home in Ohio. But Sarah had trained for shots exactly like this, and she had the equipment and skills to make it successfully. Sarah adjusted her rifle's position slightly to account for the increased range, and the light crosswind she could see affecting the grass and bushes on the hillside. She controlled her breathing, settled the crosshairs on the small portion of the target that was visible, and began the slow trigger squeeze that her grandfather had drilled into her until it became second nature. The rifle fired, and Sarah watched through her scope as the bullet found its target. The enemy fighter with the RPG dropped his weapon and disappeared behind the rocks, no longer a threat to the advancing soldiers. Sarah had now eliminated 3 enemy fighters, significantly reducing the threat level for the entire convoy. Rodriguez's voice came over the radio, filled with genuine admiration. "I don't know who's doing the shooting back there, but you're saving lives. Keep it up if you can." But keeping it up was becoming increasingly difficult. The concentrated enemy fire had finally found its mark, and Sarah heard the truck's engine begin to knock and sputter. Steam was rising from the radiator, and she could smell the acrid odor of burning oil and coolant. The truck wasn't going to remain operational much longer. Tommy tried to coax more performance from the failing engine, but it was clear that they were running out of time. "We've got maybe 5 minutes before this thing dies completely," he warned. Santos was monitoring the radio traffic while keeping watch for threats from other directions. The convoy's 2 escort vehicles were still operational, but they were both engaged in supporting Rodriguez's advancing soldiers and couldn't provide immediate assistance to the supply truck. Sarah continued scanning for targets through her rifle scope, looking for opportunities to eliminate more enemy fighters before her position became untenable. She spotted another enemy position on the left-hand hill, a fighter who had been relatively quiet during the engagement, but was now beginning to fire more aggressively as Rodriguez's soldiers advanced. This target was in an extremely difficult position to engage, located behind a large boulder that provided almost complete concealment. Sarah could only see small portions of the fighter when he exposed himself to fire at the advancing soldiers. She would have to time her shot perfectly, firing the instant the target became visible and hoping that her bullet would arrive before he could take cover again. Sarah waited with the patience her grandfather had taught her, watching through the scope for the pattern of the enemy fighter's movements. Like most people, he was developing a rhythm, exposing himself to fire for approximately the same amount of time at regular intervals. Sarah timed the pattern, calculated where she needed to aim, and prepared to take the most challenging shot of her life. When the target appeared, Sarah was ready. Her shot was fired before the enemy fighter had fully exposed himself, and the bullet arrived just as he was beginning to aim at one of Rodriguez's advancing soldiers. It was a perfect demonstration of the kind of predictive shooting that separated expert marksmen from merely good ones. Rodriguez's voice crackled over the radio again, this time with amazement as well as gratitude. "Outstanding shooting. You just saved Johnson's life." He was about to walk into that guy's crosshairs. But Sarah's success was creating new problems. The remaining enemy fighters had clearly identified the truck as a major threat, and they were now concentrating all their available firepower on eliminating her position. Bullets were striking the truck's armor continuously, creating a deafening hammering sound that made communication difficult. More seriously, some of the enemy fire was finding weak points in the truck's armor. Military vehicles were designed to protect against small arms fire, but they weren't invulnerable, especially when subjected to concentrated fire from multiple directions. Sarah could hear bullets beginning to penetrate the cargo area, ricocheting off the metal cases and equipment stored in the back of the truck. Santos made a command decision. "Sarah, we need to relocate immediately. This position is about to become completely untenable." Sarah took one more look through her rifle scope, searching for additional targets that she might be able to engage before they moved. She spotted two more enemy positions, but both were well concealed and would require difficult shots under ideal conditions. With the truck taking concentrated fire and beginning to fail mechanically, the conditions were far from ideal. Tommy managed to get the truck moving again, but progress was slow and the engine was clearly on the verge of complete failure. Black smoke was now pouring from under the hood, and the engine was making sounds that no diesel engine should make. They had minutes at most before the truck would be completely disabled. As they moved, Sarah maintained her position at the rear window, continuing to watch for opportunities to engage enemy targets. The movement made accurate shooting nearly impossible, but she could still provide intelligence about enemy positions and movements to Rodriguez's advancing soldiers. Rodriguez had managed to get two of his fire teams into positions where they could effectively engage the remaining enemy fighters. The ambush that had begun with the enemy holding all the advantages was now turning into a running gunfight where the convoy's superior training and equipment were beginning to tell. Through her scope, Sarah could see that the remaining enemy fighters were beginning to withdraw from their positions. They had lost at least 4 fighters to her precision shooting, and Rodriguez's soldiers were now close enough to threaten their positions with direct assault. The ambush was failing, and the smart move for the enemy was to break contact and escape while they still could. But retreating enemies could still be dangerous, especially if they had prepared secondary positions or were planning to set up another ambush further along the convoy's route. Sarah continued to watch through her scope, tracking the movement of enemy fighters as they attempted to disengage from the battle. Tommy finally found a position where the truck could stop behind some natural cover, providing protection from most of the enemy positions while still allowing Sarah to maintain overwatch of the battlefield. The truck's engine was barely running, but it was still operational enough to move if necessary. Rodriguez's soldiers had succeeded in reaching positions where they could effectively engage the remaining enemy fighters, but the enemy was withdrawing in good order, using covering fire and tactical movement to minimize their losses. Several enemy fighters had already disappeared into the rocky terrain, where pursuing them would be extremely dangerous for Rodriguez's soldiers. Sarah continued to provide overwatch, but the range was increasing as the enemy withdrew, and the tactical situation was stabilizing. Rodriguez had succeeded in breaking up the ambush and was now in a position to evacuate his wounded soldiers and continue the mission to observation post Mustang. The air support that Santos had requested finally arrived in the form of an Apache attack helicopter that had been diverted from another mission. The helicopter's thermal imaging systems quickly identified the remaining enemy positions, but most of the fighters had already withdrawn beyond effective range. Sarah finally allowed herself to relax slightly, setting down the rifle she had been holding for what felt like hours but had probably been less than 30 minutes. Her hands were steady, but she could feel the tension beginning to leave her body as the immediate danger passed. Santos crawled back to where Sarah was positioned. "How many?" she asked quietly. Sarah thought for a moment, counting the confirmed targets she had engaged. 4 confirmed eliminations, possibly one more that I'm not sure about. Santos shook her head in amazement. "Sarah, do you understand what you just did? You single-handedly turned around an ambush that could have killed all of us." Sarah looked out at the battlefield, where Rodriguez's soldiers were now moving to secure the area and evacuate their wounded. 2 soldiers had been seriously wounded in the ambush, but both were alive and would survive with proper medical treatment. Without her intervention, Sarah knew the casualties would have been much higher. Tommy finally succeeded in completely shutting down the truck's failing engine. The convoy would need to call for recovery assistance, but they had survived the ambush and could continue their mission using the 2 escort vehicles. Rodriguez's voice came over the radio one final time as the immediate tactical situation was brought under control. "I want to personally thank whoever was doing the precision shooting from the supply truck. You saved lives today, and I won't forget it." Sarah keyed her radio microphone for the first time during the entire engagement. "Just doing my job, Sergeant," she said quietly. But Sarah knew that what she had done was far more than just her job. She had stepped outside her assigned role as a supply clerk and become something she had never expected to be, a combat soldier who had made the difference between life and death for her fellow soldiers. The quiet supply girl who had tried to remain invisible for 8 months had just announced her presence to the entire unit in the most dramatic way possible. Word of Sarah's actions during the ambush spread through forward operating base Shank faster than wildfire in dry grass. By the time the convoy returned to base that evening, using the 2 escort vehicles after the supply truck had finally died completely, soldiers were already gathering to hear the details of what had happened on the road to observation post Mustang. Sarah found the attention overwhelming and uncomfortable. She had spent 8 months cultivating invisibility, moving through the base without drawing notice or comment. Now, everywhere she went, conversations stopped and soldiers stared. Some nodded respectfully. Others approached her directly to offer congratulations or ask questions about the engagement. The quiet anonymity that had defined her military experience was gone forever. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez made sure that Sarah's actions were properly documented and reported up the chain of command. He had been in the Army long enough to know that heroic actions in combat needed to be officially recognized, both for the individual soldier's career and to ensure that other soldiers understood the standards of performance expected in combat situations. Rodriguez found Sarah in the supply depot the morning after the ambush, where she was trying to return to her normal routine of inventory and paperwork. She was methodically checking serial numbers on equipment, the same tedious work she had been doing for months, as if nothing had changed. "Martinez," Rodriguez said, using her last name in the formal military manner. "We need to talk." Sarah looked up from her clipboard, clearly uncomfortable with the attention. "If this is about the missing equipment from yesterday, I can explain the circumstances of the loss." Rodriguez smiled slightly. This isn't about missing equipment. This is about what you did out there. Do you understand the significance of your actions? Sarah set down her clipboard and looked Rodriguez directly in the eyes. I did what needed to be done to protect my fellow soldiers. That's what we're all here for. Rodriguez nodded approvingly. He had been wondering how Sarah would handle the aftermath of her combat performance, whether success would make her arrogant or whether she would maintain the quiet professionalism he had observed in her work. Her response told him everything he needed to know about her character. That's exactly the right attitude, Rodriguez said. But you need to understand that what you did was exceptional. For confirmed enemy killed in action at ranges between 400 and 600 yards under combat conditions while taking effective enemy fire. That's the kind of performance we expect from our best trained snipers, not from supply clerks. Sarah shifted uncomfortably. My grandfather taught me to shoot when I was young. I just applied what he taught me. Rodriguez had read Sarah's personnel file and knew about her background, but he was beginning to understand that the file didn't tell the whole story. Your grandfather must have been quite a teacher. What was his background? Sarah hesitated for a moment, then decided to answer honestly. He was a sniper in Vietnam. Army, like me. He never talked much about what he did over there, but he taught me everything he knew about shooting. Rodriguez felt pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. Sarah's calm under pressure, her ability to read terrain and identify target priorities, her instinctive understanding of combat shooting principles. These weren't skills she had learned from basic military training or weekend hunting trips. She had been trained by a combat veteran who understood what real marksmanship meant. Sarah, I'm recommending you for the Bronze Star with V device for valor in combat. What you did yesterday saved lives and changed the outcome of that engagement. That kind of performance deserves official recognition. Sarah looked genuinely surprised. Sergeant, I appreciate the thought, but I don't need a medal. I was just trying to help my friends. Rodriguez shook his head firmly. This isn't about what you need, Martinez. This is about what the Army needs. Other soldiers need to see that exceptional performance in combat is recognized and rewarded. And, frankly, you've earned it. Rodriguez paused, then continued with a more serious tone. There's something else we need to discuss. I'm also recommending that you be considered for transfer to a sniper unit. Your skills are wasted in supply, and we need soldiers with your abilities in positions where they can make a difference. Sarah felt a mix of excitement and apprehension at the suggestion. Part of her had always wanted to be in a combat role, to use the skills her grandfather had taught her in the way they were intended to be used. But another part of her was comfortable with the predictable routine of supply work, the clear responsibilities, and measurable outcomes. I'm honored by the suggestion, Sergeant, Sarah said carefully, but I'm not sure I'm ready for that kind of responsibility. Rodriguez studied her face for a moment. Martinez, yesterday you took responsibility for the lives of every soldier in that convoy. You made split-second decisions under fire that determined whether your friends lived or died. If you can handle that kind of responsibility, you can handle anything a sniper unit might ask of you. Sarah considered Rodriguez's words. He was right about the responsibility she had already taken, though she hadn't thought about it in those terms. Every shot she had fired had been a decision that affected not just her target, but the soldiers who were depending on her to eliminate threats and provide overwatch. What would transfer to a sniper unit mean? Sarah asked. Rodriguez leaned against the supply depot's metal shelving. Specialized training, first at the Army Sniper School at Fort Benning. 6 weeks of the most intensive marksmanship and fieldcraft training the Army provides. After that, assignment to a sniper team, probably with one of the infantry battalions. It's demanding work, but it's also some of the most important work we do. Sarah thought about her grandfather and the quiet pride he had taken in his military service. He had never pushed her to follow in his footsteps, but she knew he would be proud to see her using the skills he had taught her in service to her country and her fellow soldiers. Can I think about it? Sarah asked. Rodriguez nodded. Of course, but don't take too long. Opportunities like this don't come along often, and the Army has a way of forgetting about exceptional performance if it's not acted on quickly. After Rodriguez left, Sarah returned to her inventory work, but her mind was elsewhere. She kept thinking about the moment during the ambush when she had made the decision to get the rifle from the back of the truck. It hadn't felt like a heroic decision at the time, just a practical response to a tactical problem. But looking back, she realized it had been a defining moment that changed everything about how she saw herself and her role in the Army. Later that day, Sarah received a visit from Captain Williams, the company commander. Captain Williams was a veteran officer who had commanded soldiers in multiple deployments, and Sarah had rarely interacted with him directly during her time at the base. Specialist Martinez, Captain Williams said formally, "I wanted to personally thank you for your actions during yesterday's engagement. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez has briefed me on the tactical situation and your role in resolving it." Sarah stood at attention, uncertain how to respond to praise from such a high-ranking officer. "Thank you, sir. I was just doing what needed to be done." Captain Williams smiled. "That's exactly what the best soldiers always say. But I want you to understand that what you did was far beyond the normal call of duty. You demonstrated the kind of initiative and skill under fire that defines exceptional soldiers." The captain paused, then continued in a more personal tone. "I've been in the Army for 15 years, and I've seen a lot of combat. What you did yesterday ranks among the most impressive individual performances I've ever witnessed. 4 enemy killed at long range, under effective enemy fire, while your position was taking concentrated fire. That's the kind of performance that legends are made of." Sarah felt deeply uncomfortable with the praise, partly because she still didn't fully understand what made her actions so unusual. To her, she had simply applied the skills her grandfather had taught her to a situation that required those skills. The technical aspects of the shooting hadn't been particularly challenging compared to some of the targets her grandfather had set up for her during their training sessions. "Sir, I had good equipment and a stable shooting position. The targets were clearly visible and within my effective range. It wasn't as difficult as it might seem." Captain Williams stared at her for a moment, then began to laugh. "Martinez, do you have any idea how many trained snipers would have trouble making the shots you made yesterday? Do you understand that most soldiers, even experienced infantry soldiers, have never fired a shot in anger, much less engaged multiple targets at long range?" Sarah was beginning to understand that her background was more unusual than she had realized. Growing up on her grandfather's farm, spending weekends hunting and practicing marksmanship had given her skills and experience that most soldiers never acquired. What felt normal and natural to her was actually quite rare, even in the military. Captain Williams continued his explanation. "The Army has thousands of soldiers, but only a few hundred trained snipers. Of those trained snipers, only a small percentage have ever engaged multiple targets in a single engagement under combat conditions. What you did yesterday puts you in very select company." Sarah was beginning to appreciate the magnitude of what had happened during the ambush. She had always known she was a good shot, but she had never considered herself exceptional. Her grandfather's standards had been so high, and his expectations so demanding, that she had never felt like she had fully mastered the skills he was teaching her. "Sir, if I may ask, what happens now?" Sarah said. Captain Williams became more serious. "That depends partly on what you want to happen. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez has recommended you for both the Bronze Star and for transfer to specialized training. Those recommendations have my full support, but ultimately the decision about your future is yours to make." Sarah thought about the choice she was facing. She could remain in supply, continuing the safe and predictable work that had defined her military experience so far. Or she could accept the opportunity to use her skills in the way they were intended to be used, taking on greater responsibility and greater risks. "What would you do, sir, if you were in my position?" Sarah asked. Captain Williams considered his answer carefully. "Martinez, I've been in the Army long enough to know that opportunities to make a real difference are rare and precious. Most soldiers serve honorably and contribute to the mission, but few have the chance to directly save lives and change outcomes the way you did yesterday." He paused, then continued. "If I had your skills and if the Army was willing to give me the training and support to use those skills effectively, I would take that opportunity without hesitation. The Army needs soldiers like you in positions where your abilities can have the greatest impact. Sarah nodded slowly. She was beginning to understand that her decision wasn't just about her own career or personal satisfaction. It was about how she could best serve her fellow soldiers and her country. That evening, Sarah called her grandfather from the base's communications center. It was the first time she had spoken to him since the ambush, and she wanted his advice about the decision she was facing. Miguel Martinez listened quietly as Sarah described what had happened during the convoy to observation post-Mustang. She told him about identifying the enemy positions, about getting the rifle from the back of the truck, and about the shots she had made under combat conditions. When she finished her account, there was a long silence on the phone. Finally, her grandfather spoke, his voice thick with emotion. "Mija, I'm so proud of you. You did exactly what you were trained to do, and you did it perfectly. Those soldiers are alive today because of the skills we practiced together in those woods behind the farm." Sarah felt tears beginning to form in her eyes. "Grandfather, they want to send me to sniper school and transfer me to a combat unit. I'm not sure if I'm ready for that kind of responsibility." Miguel's response was immediate and firm. "Sarah, you were ready yesterday when you picked up that rifle. You were ready when you made those shots under fire. The training you'll receive at sniper school will make you better, but the most important qualities, the courage, the skill, and the judgment you already have." Sarah knew her grandfather was right. The hardest part hadn't been making the shots. It had been making the decision to get involved in the first place. Once she had committed to action, everything else had followed naturally from her training and instincts. "What do you think I should do?" Sarah asked. Miguel's answer came without hesitation. "I think you should honor the gifts you've been given by using them to protect others. That's what soldiers do, and that's what snipers do better than anyone else." After ending the call with her grandfather, Sarah walked back to her quarters through the quiet base. The decision that had seemed so difficult a few hours earlier now seemed obvious. She had been given exceptional skills and the opportunity to use them in service to her fellow soldiers. Refusing that opportunity would be a betrayal of everything her grandfather had taught her about duty and service. The next morning, Sarah found Staff Sergeant Rodriguez in the motor pool, where he was supervising maintenance on the convoy vehicles. "Sergeant," Sarah said, "I've made my decision about the transfer recommendation." Rodriguez looked up from the vehicle he was inspecting, and Sarah stood at attention and spoke clearly. "I would be honored to accept transfer to sniper training and assignment to a combat unit." Rodriguez smiled broadly. "Outstanding, Martinez. I'll start the paperwork immediately. You're going to make an exceptional sniper." As Rodriguez walked away to begin the administrative process that would change the course of Sarah's military career, Sarah reflected on how much her life had changed in the space of just 2 days. She was no longer the invisible supply clerk who had tried to avoid attention and responsibility. She was about to become something she had never expected to be, a professional soldier whose job would be to use the deadliest skills in warfare to protect her fellow soldiers. The quiet girl from Ohio was about to disappear forever, replaced by something harder and more dangerous. But Sarah knew it was the right choice, the choice that honored both her training and her commitment to the soldiers who depended on her. 6 weeks later, Sarah stood on the firing line at Fort Benning, Georgia, preparing for her final qualification at the Army Sniper School. The transformation from supply clerk to trained sniper had been more intense than anything she had experienced in her military career, but it had also been the most rewarding training of her life. The Army Sniper School was designed to take soldiers who already possessed exceptional marksmanship skills and turn them into precision weapons specialists capable of operating independently in the most demanding combat environments. Sarah had arrived at the school with natural ability and solid fundamentals, but she was leaving as a completely different kind of soldier. The training had been comprehensive and demanding, covering everything from advanced marksmanship techniques to camouflage and concealment, stalking and observation, range estimation, and weather analysis. Sarah had learned to make accurate shots at ranges she had never attempted before, under conditions that would have been impossible for most soldiers to even attempt. But the technical skills, impressive as they were, represented only part of her transformation. The real change had been in her understanding of what it meant to be a sniper and what responsibilities came with that designation. Snipers weren't just soldiers who could shoot accurately at long range. They were intelligence gatherers, force multipliers, and strategic assets whose actions could influence entire operations. Sergeant First Class David Thompson, Sarah's primary instructor at sniper school, had been a sniper for 12 years and had combat experience in Iraq, Afghanistan, and several classified operations. He had seen many promising students pass through the school, but Sarah had impressed him with both her natural ability and her professional attitude. Martinez, Thompson said as Sarah prepared for her final qualification, "You came here with better fundamentals than most students acquired during the entire course. But what's more impressive is how you've absorbed the mental aspects of sniper operations. You understand that this isn't just about shooting, it's about thinking." Sarah nodded as she checked her equipment one final time. The final qualification required her to engage multiple targets at ranges from 300 to 1,000 yards, under time pressure, with varying weather conditions and target presentations. It was designed to simulate the kind of complex tactical situations that snipers faced in actual combat operations. "Sergeant, I had a good foundation to build on," Sarah replied. "My grandfather taught me that shooting was as much mental as physical, and that patience and observation were as important as accuracy." Thompson smiled. "Your grandfather sounds like he was a hell of a soldier. The lessons he taught you have served you well here." Sarah's thoughts turned briefly to Miguel Martinez, who had passed away suddenly from a heart attack just 3 weeks in her sniper training. She had been granted emergency leave to attend his funeral, and the loss had been devastating. But his influence on her training and her understanding of what it meant to be a soldier continued to guide her every day. The funeral had been held in the small cemetery behind the church where Miguel had worshipped for 40 years. Sarah had worn her dress uniform, and she had been surprised by the number of Vietnam veterans who had attended to honor her grandfather. Many of them had served with Miguel, and they had shared stories about his service that Sarah had never heard before. One elderly veteran, a man named Frank Collins, who had been Miguel's spotter in Vietnam, had pulled Sarah aside after the service. "Your grandfather saved my life more than once over there," Collins had told her. "He was the best sniper I ever worked with, and for what I hear, you're following in his footsteps." Collins had given Sarah something that had belonged to her grandfather, a small notebook filled with handwritten observations about wind reading, range estimation, and shooting techniques. Miguel had kept detailed notes throughout his military service, and the notebook contained lessons learned from actual combat operations. Sarah had studied the notebook every night during the remainder of her sniper training, learning from her grandfather's experiences in ways that no formal instruction could provide. Now, as she prepared for her final qualification, Sarah felt Miguel's presence with her. The lessons he had taught her during those weekend hunting trips had been preparing her for this moment, though neither of them had known it at the time. The qualification began with targets at 300 yards, relatively close range for a trained sniper, but requiring precision and speed. Sarah engaged each target with the same methodical approach her grandfather had taught her: proper position, controlled breathing, sight picture, smooth trigger squeeze. Each shot found its mark with mechanical precision. As the range increased and the targets became more challenging, Sarah found herself entering the mental state that her grandfather had called the zone, a state of complete focus where external distractions disappeared and only the shooter, the rifle, and the target existed. It was a state she had achieved during hunting trips with Miguel, and it was the same state she had entered during the ambush that had started her journey to sniper school. The final targets were at 1,000 yards, at the extreme range of the rifle and optical system she was using. At this distance, factors like wind speed, air temperature, and humidity could dramatically affect bullet trajectory. Sarah had learned to read these conditions instinctively, using techniques that combined the formal instruction she had received at sniper school with the practical knowledge her grandfather had passed down to her. Sarah engaged the final targets with the same calm precision she had demonstrated throughout the qualification. Each shot was carefully planned and executed, taking into account all the variables that could affect accuracy at extreme range. When the last shot was fired and the targets were scored, Sarah had achieved a perfect score, something that fewer than 10% of sniper school students accomplished. Thompson reviewed Sarah's targets with genuine admiration. Outstanding shooting, Martinez. You've just set a new record for this course. But more importantly, you've demonstrated that you have the skills and temperament to be an effective sniper in combat operations. Sarah felt a deep sense of satisfaction, not just in her personal achievement, but in the knowledge that she had honored her grandfather's memory and validated the training he had provided. She was ready to return to combat operations as a fully qualified sniper, equipped with skills that could make a real difference in protecting her fellow soldiers. 2 weeks later, Sarah found herself back in Afghanistan, but in a very different role than she had occupied during her first deployment. Instead of being assigned to a supply unit, she was now part of a sniper team attached to the 3rd Battalion, 75th Ranger Regiment, one of the Army's most elite infantry units. Her partner was Staff Sergeant Marcus Johnson, a veteran sniper with 4 combat deployments and a reputation for professionalism and effectiveness. Johnson had initially been skeptical about being paired with a soldier who had started her career in supply, but Sarah's performance at sniper school and her combat record from the convoy ambush had convinced him that she was capable of handling the demands of sniper operations. Their first mission together was overwatch for a special operations raid on a compound suspected of harboring high-value targets. Sarah and Johnson positioned themselves on a hilltop approximately 800 yards from the target compound, where they could observe the entire operation and provide precision fire support if needed. As Sarah settled into her shooting position and began scanning the compound through her rifle scope, she reflected on how much her life had changed since that morning when she had prepared for what was supposed to be a routine supply convoy. The shy, invisible supply clerk who had tried to avoid attention and responsibility had been replaced by a confident, highly trained soldier whose job was to use deadly force in support of critical military operations. The raid proceeded smoothly, with the Special Operations Team successfully capturing their targets without encountering significant resistance. Sarah and Johnson maintained overwatch throughout the operation, ready to engage any threats that might emerge, but their intervention wasn't required. As they packed their equipment after the successful completion of the mission, Johnson offered his assessment of Sarah's performance. Martinez, you did good work out there. Your observation skills are outstanding, and your shooting position was textbook perfect. I think we're going to work well together. Sarah felt a sense of professional pride that was different from anything she had experienced during her time in supply. She was now part of an elite community of soldiers whose skills and judgment were trusted with the most critical and dangerous missions. It was exactly what she had hoped for when she had first enlisted, but it had taken an unexpected path to get there. Over the following months, Sarah and Johnson completed numerous missions together, ranging from long-range reconnaissance to direct support of infantry operations. Sarah's skills continued to develop with each mission, and she began to understand why snipers were considered such valuable assets by military commanders. The work was demanding and dangerous, but it was also deeply satisfying in a way that supply duty had never been. Every mission mattered, and every shot she fired had strategic significance that went far beyond the immediate tactical situation. Sarah was using her skills to protect soldiers, gather intelligence, and support operations that contributed directly to the broader military mission in Afghanistan. 6 months after completing sniper school, Sarah received word that she had been awarded the Bronze Star with V device for her actions during the convoy ambush that had started her transformation from supply clerk to sniper. The medal was presented during a formal ceremony at Forward Operating Base Shank, with many of the soldiers who had been present during the ambush in attendance. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, who had initiated the recommendation for both the medal and Sarah's transfer to sniper training, served as the presenter for the ceremony. As he pinned the medal to Sarah's uniform, he offered words that captured the essence of what had made her actions so significant. Specialist Martinez demonstrated the highest traditions of military service by placing the lives of her fellow soldiers above her own safety, Rodriguez said. Her actions under fire saved lives and changed the outcome of a desperate tactical situation. She exemplifies the courage, skill, and dedication that defines the finest soldiers in the United States Army. Sarah felt deeply moved by the ceremony, not just because of the personal recognition, but because of what it represented about the values and traditions she had committed herself to upholding. The medal wasn't just recognition of what she had done during the ambush. It was acknowledgement of her commitment to use her skills and service to something larger than herself. After the ceremony, Sarah visited the base communications center to call her grandmother, Miguel's widow, who had been following Sarah's military career with pride and concern. Elena Martinez had always worried about her granddaughter's safety, but she also understood the importance of the work Sarah was doing. "Abuela," Sarah said when Elena answered the phone, "I wanted to let you know about the medal ceremony today." Elena's voice was filled with emotion as she responded. "Mija, your grandfather would be so proud of you. He always said that the greatest honor a soldier could receive was the respect of the soldiers who fought beside him. That medal represents their respect for what you did to protect them." Sarah felt tears forming in her eyes as she listened to her grandmother's words. "I think about him every day, abuela. Everything I do out here is built on what he taught me." Elena's voice became firm and proud. "You are carrying on a tradition of service that goes back generations in our family. Your grandfather served, your father served, and now you're serving. But you are the first to earn recognition for valor in combat. That makes me very proud." After ending the call with her grandmother, Sarah walked back to her quarters through the base that had become her home. She thought about the journey that had brought her from the invisible supply clerk to the decorated sniper she had become. It had been a transformation she could never have imagined when she first arrived in Afghanistan, but it felt like the natural result of all the experiences and training that had shaped her life. The quiet girl from Ohio was still there, in the patience and attention to detail that made her an effective sniper. But she had been joined by something harder and more confident, a professional soldier who understood her capabilities and was prepared to use them in the most demanding situations. Sarah Martinez had found her place in the Army, and the Army had found a soldier whose skills and character exemplified the best of what military service could be. The question, "Any snipers here?" would never be asked in vain again when Sarah was around, because the quiet supply girl had become the sniper who could save everyone.